Today I'm sharing with you a German cake called Donauwelle, or Schneewittchenkuchen. This means either waves of the Danube, or another name for it is Snow White cake. And this is a very popular cake in Germany, and I actually have a lot of fond memories of this cake because I got to stay with a German host family many years ago. I stayed with the same family 2 summers in a row in a little village right outside the Black Forest. And my host mother showed me how to make this cake, and we brought it to a Kaffee und Kuchen at her mother's house on a Sunday afternoon. So how very German is that? This is a vanilla sponge on the bottom, marbled with a chocolate sponge and sour cherries baked into that, and then a layer of German buttercream, which I'll tell you what that is later, and then a top layer of hard chocolate. It's absolutely delicious, especially if you love chocolate and cherries, one of my favorite combinations. So let's get into the video and I'll talk more about where this cake comes from, as well as how to make it. So let's get started. There's 3 different elements to making this cake. There's the sponge on the bottom, there is the buttercream in the middle, and then the hard chocolate on top. So to start, we're gonna start with the buttercream just because some of it needs to chill before we can proceed to the next step. But I first want to talk about what is German buttercream. Here in the United States, buttercream is a frosting made with butter whipped with powdered sugar and then any flavorings you want to add to it, such as vanilla or something else. But in Germany, their version of buttercream is a little bit different. They usually will mix vanilla pudding beaten with butter and sugar, and they use it to fill cakes as well as frost cakes. Now, most Germans do not make this from scratch. I know that's a really wide sweeping statement, and I can't speak for all Germans, but when you're searching for a lot of these recipes filled or frosted with German buttercream in cookbooks as well as on the internet, you often do not find the recipe for how to make this from scratch. Usually it calls for 1 packet of vanilla pudding mix mixed with the rest of the ingredients to make the buttercream. But we don't all live in Germany and we don't all have access to Dr. Oetker vanilla pudding or whatever other brands they sell in Germany. So I thought we would make it from scratch. So really what vanilla pudding is a pastry cream. And to make the German version of buttercream, we're going to first make the pastry cream, let that chill, and then we're going to beat softened butter into the pastry cream, and that's going to be the German buttercream, because that's really what it is. That's what they're making when they make a packet of vanilla pudding and then beat butter into it. Now, the French have the same version of this, and they call it mousseline, and they often use it as fillings and things. So, is German buttercream its own thing? Does it come from the French mousseline? I don't know. I don't know the true origins of either. But today we're going to make that from scratch, and that's what we're going to start with. So I'm adding my whole milk to a medium-sized saucepan on the stove. I'm going to turn the heat on medium and let it heat up until little bubbles form around the edges. You don't want to let it boil because then a skin will form, just till you see little bubbles. To make the pastry cream, we're just going to mix some egg yolks with some granulated sugar. Whisk that together. It might seem hard to mix at first, but as the egg yolks absorb that sugar and you work it, it starts to become more stirrable. So just do this until it's really light and much easier to stir. It becomes a little bit more liquidy, and that sugar has incorporated into the egg yolks really well. So you see it went from barely being able to be mixed to pourable. Now we're just going to add in our starches, which are cornstarch. If you don't have cornstarch, you can use potato starch, and all-purpose flour. It's going to be the same thing here, where it feels like you can't really mix it at first. And then as you keep going, it becomes more pliable.
So now I'm just adding some of the hot milk into the eggs to temper them. And once I stir this in and get the egg yolks used to the heat, I'm going to pour them back into the saucepan with the rest of the milk. So now that I've tempered the egg yolks, I'm adding them back into the hot milk. Then I'm going to cook this mixture on the stove while whisking continuously until it forms the consistency of a thick pudding. And once it reaches this stage where it bubbles and burps, continue to cook it for 1 to 2 more minutes, and then you're going to take it off the heat.
And then after making the pastry cream, I always like to sieve it just to make sure that there aren't any cooked eggs that shouldn't be in there. Sometimes little bits of egg yolk curdle unexpectedly. You could make your pastry cream over a bain-marie, which is where you have like a double boiler, but I feel like that's too much effort, so I always just, it usually turns out fine for me. I always just do it this way where I sieve it just to make sure that there aren't any little bits of cooked egg. So next you're going to put this in the refrigerator to chill, but I like to put it in a really shallow pan so that it takes a lot less time. So I'm gonna put it in this 9x13 casserole dish and then cover that with plastic wrap. So now we're going to get started on the second component, which is the cake portion of it. And I want to show you the pan I'm using. This is an expandable cake form and it's rectangular, and you can expand it to different sizes. You just place it on a baking sheet with parchment paper under it. And it's very heavy, so it stays where it's put. Now, the reason I chose this is because most of the time Germans will make this cake and other sheet cakes in deep baking sheets, and they have ovens where you slide these baking sheets into the oven racks where they're held up by the sides, and you can have really like shallow ones and then really deep ones. And so they tend to make these sheet style cakes in the deeper baking sheets. Now, I've never seen anything like that sold in the United States, so I picked up one of these cake forms so that I could make the cake the size it was supposed to be, and then it also had sides to it. So you can make it in something like that if you happen to have something like that, or you can make it like this, and this actually gives a much nicer finish because you can take this off at the end and you can see all the layers of the cake, and it has almost like a really polished bakery style finish to it. So if you want to pick up something like this, I will link what I bought below. I was able to find this on Amazon. It wasn't too expensive. You also could just try making it in a baking sheet without the sides holding it up. It may not have as nice of a form. It may not have the beautiful straight sides, but you could also trim those off at the end and kind of give it a polished look that way, where you assemble everything and then you slice off the edges just to give it a more polished look. So those are a couple of options of what to do about the baking pan.
To make the sponge, you're going to add sugar and softened unsalted butter to a stand mixer with a pinch of salt. And you're going to beat this on medium to medium high speed until it's light and fluffy and also light pale yellow in color. Then you're going to mix in the eggs, and you're going to do the eggs one at a time until they're fully incorporated into the butter and sugar. You don't want to add the next egg in until the first egg is fully mixed in. And oh, I also forgot vanilla sugar. This is what Germans use instead of vanilla extract. You don't have to use vanilla sugar if you can't find it at your grocery store, though I will link it below for the Amazon link. If you want, you can use a teaspoon of vanilla extract instead. Then you're going to add all-purpose flour and baking powder and give that a whisk, and then incorporate that into the wet ingredients. You're going to turn your mixer on the lowest speed so that it doesn't fly everywhere, and just mix until incorporated. You don't want to go any further than that because this is the stage where cakes can become tough if you overwork the gluten in the flour.
So now that we have our cake batter all mixed together, we're going to put half of it into the pan. And you're going to leave the other half and we're going to mix that with cocoa powder, and that's going to be our second layer that creates that marbled effect. So just scoop in the first half that's going to be vanilla flavored. Now the easiest way to spread this is with an offset spatula, but I only have a long one. So I have a sort of offset spatula with this little butter knife. So that's what I'm going to use to spread it. And you know, the Germans have a penchant for this type of cake where you have a small amount of batter that you have to spread over a large surface. It's a little bit tedious, but the end result is lovely, so it's worth the patience. So if it feels tedious at first, just keep at it. You'll eventually get it spread over every corner, and it'll look smooth in no time.
With the remaining half of the cake batter, you're going to add in cocoa powder and milk and give that a quick mix. Like I said, don't overwork this, it'll become tough.
Now I've added that cocoa powder and the milk so we can make our marbled cake. So take the cake batter that you've just mixed together, and you're going to spread it in the same way that you did the first layer. So the origins of this cake aren't super well known. This is a very popular cake all throughout Austria and Germany. Everybody knows Donauwelle. If you ask any German or Austrian if they've had it before, the answer is most likely going to be yes. And they serve it even in school cafeterias, they serve it in bakeries, people make it at home. That's how popular it is. In some regions, they don't call it Donauwelle, they call it Schneewittchenkuchen, which means Snow White cake, as in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because of the colors of the cake. The chocolate layer represents Snow White's hair, and the white cream layer, her skin, and then the cherries, her red lips. But then Donauwelle is another name for it, probably the more popular name, and that refers to the Danube River, and not because this was likely created somewhere near the Danube, but rather it's just a name describing the waves of the chocolate and cherries marbled throughout the cake layers. So it was just a creative name to give to this cake. Some of the first printed recipes are really from the 60s. So it seems to be probably a mid-century recipe. I've talked before in some of my other German cake videos about the tradition of Kaffee und Kuchen, which means coffee and cake, which is where people would get together on a Sunday afternoon and enjoy a cup of coffee and a slice of cake together. This was often just a women's thing, and then it became a co-ed event between families and friends getting together on a Sunday afternoon. You can learn more about the origins of that in my German peach streusel cake video, so I will link that below and you can watch that one after this one. I appreciate all of the European countries and their baking traditions, but I have a special place in my heart for German baking traditions just because I spent a lot of time in Germany when I was younger. And so if you ever are interested in a series on German cakes, please let me know, because that's something I would love to share with you all. There are so many different cakes to feature from Germany. So back to this, I'm just spreading the cake batter in the same way that I spread the vanilla cake batter. Just getting it pretty even and all the way to the corners so that it looks nice and tidy when we take it out of the cake form. And then once I'm finished with this, I'm going to pop cherries into the batter. I've drained 2 jars of sour cherries, and now I'm just going to put them in rows in the batter and press them down into the batter. Pressing them down will create that wave pattern in the marbled cake mixture.
Now bake the cake in a 350° Fahrenheit preheated oven for 30 to 35 minutes, or until you can insert a skewer and it comes out clean.
So now we're going to work on the buttercream filling. So I've taken my pastry cream out of the refrigerator, and I didn't let it chill completely. You don't want it to be hot, you don't want it to be warm, but you need it to come to room temperature at least. So I put it in for 45 minutes to an hour and then let it sit on the counter and brought it to room temperature. Same with my unsalted butter. So to make this buttercream, you need both of these to be at pretty much the same temperature, so room temperature. If they're not at the same temperature, when you mix them together, they're gonna kind of curdle and separate. It won't work out. So I'm going to beat the unsalted butter with some vanilla extract until it's light and fluffy, and then I'm going to add in spoonfuls of the pastry cream as it's whisking, and I'm just going to whisk it until it's a really light consistency and has that spreadable feeling of like a frosting. Once the cake has come to room temperature, I actually popped my warm cake into the fridge just for a little bit to bring it down to room temperature. Once it's at room temperature, you just spread the buttercream on it. So you're just going to do an even layer of buttercream, and then you're gonna cover it up so that it doesn't harden on the top. Then you're gonna pop it in the fridge. Let that chill completely. You want it to be hard so that when you add the chocolate layer on top, the chocolate and the buttercream don't mix. You want those distinct 3 layers of ingredients.
Once your buttercream has completely chilled on the cake for about an hour, it should be hard enough to spread chocolate on. So you're going to take some chopped up dark chocolate and 2 tablespoons of vegetable oil or any neutral tasting oil, and you're going to melt that on a double boiler over the stove. And then you're going to take that and you're going to drizzle it over the top of the buttercream, and you're going to take an offset spatula and spread it the same way that you spread the batter and the same way that you spread the buttercream. You're just making an even smooth layer on the top. And then if you want, you can take a fork and make decorations in the top. You can swirl it to look like waves. That can give a little bit more of the look of waves of the Danube River. Then you're going to place this in the refrigerator for about another hour to an hour and a half until that chocolate is completely chilled and hardened, and then you can take it out of the fridge and it's ready to serve. However, I will give the caveat that it does taste a lot better if you let it sit overnight. That cream will soften the cake layers and it just tastes better the second day.
I have a piece of cake here. Let's see if this stands up to the memory I have of it. That's delicious. Definitely stands up to what I remember in my head of how that tasted. I actually haven't had this since I made it a long time ago with my German host mother. So it's like a little bite of a memory, which is really nice. I would say the cake is good, but it's kind of a background base to the whole thing. The star of the show really are the sour cherries, the cream, and the chocolate on top. What a delicious combination of flavors. If you've never had sour cherries, you should definitely see if you can find them at a store near you or online and try a recipe like this one. They have such a delicious flavor in desserts. They do have quite a different flavor than the sweet dark cherries that you get from the grocery store. So give these a try if you've never had them before. If you want another German cake to enjoy with a cup of coffee and a group of friends, check out my peach streusel cake video next. That one goes into the full history of Kaffee und Kuchen in Germany. And I'll see you next time.